limbic system per se, this wonderful system that allows us to engage with the world. In this lecture, I thought what I would do is use music as a theme to tie together information that we've covered about sensory systems and about emotional experience and also about language even, because we're going to see that music involves all of these systems. We know that music is both a sensory and an emotional experience. And one of the things I want you to take away from this lecture as well is how closely tied music is to language in human beings. So what we want to look at is how the brain processes music. Basically, our ability to be able to write music, to read music, to perform music, and to enjoy music involves the coordinated activity of many different areas of the brain, and especially the limbic system. So let's begin with just a general definition of what music sort of is, at least from a neurobiological standpoint, and how music differs from just sound. So what we want to answer is, what is it that's being processed by the brain when we listen to music? What's being processed? How is music processing different from just processing sound? So unlike simple sound, music is actually made up of tones. Now, when we talked about simple sound, we talked about how there was a series of pitches that were registered along the basilar membrane. So the point of maximal stimulation was the pitch that was heard, and there was really a map along that membrane of different pitches. Well, now we see that music is not composed of pitches. Music is composed of tones. And even a simple tone is composed of many different complex features. For example, a tone is composed of a fundamental frequency, and that is generally the lowest sound in a tone or the dominant sound in a tone, and also overtones. So overtones are related frequencies that blend with that fundamental frequency. If you hit C, for example, an overtone would be an octave higher C and also a G, and they would blend together. But the lowest C would be the fundamental frequency of the tone. Furthermore, music is really heard and appreciated as a sequence of tones. So it's something that's happening over time. It's a sequence of tones. But even more importantly, what's important in music is the relationship between tones. So like language, it's about the relationship between words. So in music, you have tones taking the place of words, and what you have is a relationship between the tones that becomes important. So this is why when you hear jingle bells in any key, you recognize it as jingle bells. It doesn't matter whether it's in the key of C or E flat major, you appreciate it as being jingle bells, because what the brain processes is the relationship between tones. And so this is what the brain actually cares about. What you have is something very, very similar to language. So in language, it isn't just a bunch of phonemes. That doesn't make a language. What you have is phonemes that are put together in a particular way that conveys meaning. And so sound alone doesn't make language, and tones alone don't make music. Both are communicating something in the way they are structured. Now, there are many other ways that language and music are very, very similar. And part of this lecture, as I said, is about helping you really appreciate this. Now, the things I'm going to talk about now are pretty obvious, but later we'll talk about some relationship between language and music that might not be so obvious to you. So I just jotted down a few ways that language and music are similar. So let's just go through some of those. First of all, both language and music show rhythm, tempo, and anticipation. So we saw with language, every language has its own sing-songy nature, has a way of inflecting how the voice rises when you're at the end of a sentence that's a question, how it lowers when you come to making a point. So there are different ways that you have rhythm and tempo. In music, you have the same kind of thing. You have rhythm and tempo that communicate something about the music. Both show anticipation. In music, the most critical thing there is that when you listen to a piece of music, even if you've never heard it before, if it's part of a particular type of musical tradition, towards the end, you can almost tell how it's going to end. And that's because the composer has led you to that point, and in that musical tradition, there's a particular type of ending that will occur. We call that anticipation. So you can anticipate what the ending is to a piece. So that's one of the ways that music and language are very similar. In another way, which is very obvious, meaning is mapped to sound or to representations of sound. So, for example, we don't just say phonemes, or the phonemic sounds don't just come out of our mouth. This is mapped to a meaning because of the way the phonemes are put together in language. Well, in music, a note doesn't represent anything that communicates. It's its relationship to other parts of the piece that actually communicates something to the audience. And also, you see that you have both an auditory experience that's involved in both, and you also have a written representation. So, for example, in music, you have, if you were not a person who could read sheet music, then if you were to look at a piece of music, it wouldn't mean anything to you. It would simply look like a bunch of squiggles on a piece of paper that didn't mean anything. You might recognize that it was music, but it wouldn't mean anything to you. You wouldn't know anything about what it represented. Well, if I don't know Japanese, then if I look at kana or kanji, then it looks just like that to me. It doesn't have any meaning for me. If I look at Arabic that is written language-wise, I might recognize what language it is that's being written, but those symbols mean absolutely nothing to my brain. So in both language and music, you see that representations of notes and representations of sounds can be written down and mean something only to the brain that has come to put the meaning with those representations or symbols. Another way they're alike is that both language and music can be generated internally. Now, this is kind of interesting. When you generate language internally, that's what we mean by thought. You kind of talk to yourself with internal thought. You use words. This is how you communicate with yourself. You chew about things in your mind, and it's words that come up in that mind. Well, you can do the same thing with music. And so you have great composers, not just Mozart, but others as well, who talk about waking up and they have this whole symphony in their head, and all they do is grab a piece of paper and try to put down the notes that have already been generated in their head. And so it can be generated in each and every one of us when we try to remember a melody, or we've all had the experience of hearing a song and not being able to get it out of our mind, and it just keeps playing over and over again. So it can be generated internally in us, just like language can. Another very important way that language and music are similar, and one, we get stuck sometimes in our thinking, and it's important to remember this, that what seems natural to us in both language and music is what we were exposed to early in life. There's nothing superior about Western music. It's what we were exposed to, and so it seems natural to us. There's nothing superior about the English language, but this is probably what most of us have been associated with when we were a child. And so this is natural to us and seems natural to our experience because we were exposed to these when we were very, very young. So the Western diatonic scale, for example, seems like real music to the Western ear. And other types of music often don't seem like they're real music to other people who are not trained in that tradition. I spent some time teaching medical school in Nepal, and that was an interesting experience on many different levels. But one of them was I became very fascinated with what in Nepal was called Hindu music, which is very closely associated with Indian music. And in that, the tonal system which is used, there's a division of what we call an octave into 22 different segments, and each of those is about roughly equivalent to a quarter of a whole tone in Western music. And listen to it as much as I could and have people point out these things to me. There was something about the music that didn't speak to me. And part of that is not because the music is inferior or any less beautiful, but because I wasn't exposed to it at a time in my life that I could come to appreciate the music so that it could touch me in an emotional sense in a particular way. And music does speak to us. It's okay to use that kind of terminology because language and music are so closely intertwined. Another way that language and music have a lot in common is that there's hemisphere dominance in both. So you remember when we were talking about language, the left hemisphere, even in left-handed individuals, is generally dominant. But you also have the other hemisphere, the right hemisphere, a non-dominant hemisphere, obviously doing something too. So each hemisphere has a sort of specialization about what's going on. Now in music, both the right and the left hemisphere appear to be equally good at processing pure tones. So you can study this in the laboratory. Both hemispheres appear to be equally good at being able to do that. But in non-musicians, those of us who are not trained in music or don't have any special talent in music, in non-musicians, the right hemisphere appears to be dominant for the appreciation of melody and harmony, and the left hemisphere is dominant for rhythm. So in a non-musician who has brain damage, what you might lose as far as appreciating music depends on which hemisphere the damage is to. Now, music and language are also similar in that they're both inventive, yet they follow rules. So if you think about it, I mean, we don't often think in these terms, but it's really significant. Language is like an open-ended software program. Yes, you have a lexicon, and yes, you have to have the words ordered in a particular way, and you do have nouns and verbs, but you can arrange those in any combination. And in fact, while I'm up here talking right now, my brain is inventing a sentence that may never have been spoken before by me. And so this is something that it's an inventive process. It goes on, it's creative, and it's a function of the brain and the ability of the hemispheres to do this. Well, music is the same way. Music is composed of particular notes, whatever tradition your music is involved with, made up of particular notes that can be arranged in almost an endless variety of sequences. There will be rules that you'll have to follow if you work within a certain tradition. But within that tradition, there's a tremendous ability to be creative with those notes. Yet there's a limited number of notes, just like there's a limited number of words that we could potentially use. So this is just one of the things that I find fascinating about both language and music. And again, I want to stress to you that random strings of phonemes don't make language. And random strings of tones, we all recognize, do not make music. So music is a very particular thing. And within our own tradition, we don't have any trouble telling what's music and what's noise. Now, languages may follow a different type of rule in some ways, but basically the rules that are followed in a particular language, whatever that language would be, the brain has the ability to abstract those rules. And the same thing is true in music. So what you're exposed to when you're young, your brain abstracts the rules that are involved in that musical tradition, what will allow you to be creative and to put those notes together into a musical form. It's probably one of the reasons why music from other cultures, if we're not exposed to it till we're older, doesn't really speak to us, because our brain is not trained to be able to pick up nuances and other things in that music that would allow it to speak to us on a personal level. And certainly, both music and language communicate. Now, we can talk for a long time. We could have a whole lecture based on just the differences in the way they communicate. We try to use language to talk about our internal subjective state or feelings. And we notice that, except for really exceptional writers, it's very difficult to do that. When you try to express your feelings to someone, words sometimes fail you. The truth is that language is much better at communicating factual knowledge. And so, for example, English has many nouns in it. And so English is really good for being able to talk about factual information related to an object. And it's very, very good at that. So what is it exactly that music communicates? Well, I have another one of my delightful quotes that I love to share with students. This is from Monroe Stearns, and this is just, I just think really encapsulates what is being expressed in music. If the existence of music in the world needs any justification, then that justification is the fact that music expresses what words cannot communicate, the essence of the universal emotions of mankind. So music has the ability to communicate emotional feelings better than language does. And we usually recognize that as we listen to music. And last of all, like language, music may also be instinctual. And so if you look at any culture, even before they were exposed to Westerners or anything, all cultures have music, just like all cultures have language. So what do we know about how the brain processes music? Well, the brain processes music. First and foremost, music is an auditory experience. So it shouldn't surprise us that auditory areas are involved in the processing. So we have Area 41, if you remember, is primary auditory cortex in the temporal lobe. And it turns out that Area 41 is probably involved in the sharpening of the fundamental frequency. That's pretty much all that Area 41 does. Music as a whole, however, the appreciation of tones, or the relationship between tones, the actual processing of the temporal sequence of music is done by higher order areas. Now, damage to these areas can produce something that you've heard about before in a different context, and that's amusia. That's a form of music agnosia. So just like you had agnosias from the loss of areas, higher order sensory areas, you can have an amusia where a person loses the ability to appreciate music. The person may lose a specific thing like the ability to appreciate rhythm or melodies. A person might not be able to tell one piece of music from another after brain damage. But this will generally be to these higher order auditory areas. Now, music thus has a sensory component. Music is also an emotional experience. And because in all cultures that music has been looked at, music is a very positive and a pleasurable sensation. It won't come as any surprise to any student taking this course that music is a limbic system experience, especially involving activation of the endogenous reward system. So music activates this system that's designed to make us feel good. And in fact, there's an increased release of dopamine and also an increased release of endorphins when you listen to music. And so these are things that give us that elevated feeling when we're listening to music. Brain damage in individuals, sadly, can take away their experience of enjoying music. And we also saw with individuals who abuse cocaine, affecting this endogenous reward system, either by damage or by altering the receptors in the system, can take away your ability to appreciate music. or at least to gain a very positive sense or feeling from listening to music. Now, music is also processed by the hippocampus. And I think something else you're learning in this class is that you want to take care of your hippocampus. It's involved in so many different things. The hippocampus appears to be involved in our ability to remember long sequences of music. And that should sort of make sense because the hippocampus is involved in sort of factual memory, and being able to remember long sequences of music involves moving from one place to another and knowing what's going to happen. And so the hippocampus is believed to play a critical role in our appreciation of music in this regard. Now, there are other structures, cingulate gyrus and other areas which also play a role, but our understanding of the exact role that's played is not well understood. So, like other areas of the brain that we've studied, we would normally turn to the research laboratory, although we don't have many animals that appreciate music in the same way we do. And in fact, almost all of our information about music and how the brain processes it are from clinical cases where individuals have had some kind of brain damage and it has altered or changed their appreciation of music in some regard. This is a human experience, like language is, and they're going to be even more closely tied together than you imagine possible. So, we have studied problems with musical perception in professional musicians who have had some type of brain damage. And these clinical cases have been incredibly informative for us to understand differences between musicians and non-musicians, and also in understanding areas of the brain that are involved. It turns out that in musicians, the left hemisphere of the brain is dominant for nearly all aspects of music. Now, let's back up. In non-musicians, the right hemisphere was involved in melody and harmony, but that's not true in musicians. In musicians, melody and harmony is dealt with by the left hemisphere. Musicians also have a left hemisphere dominance that probably plays a major role in their ability to appreciate rhythm differently than non-musicians do. And in addition, they have more of an activation of the left hippocampus that appears to be involved in their ability to remember long strings of music that most of us would never be able to do. So musicians have this ability to have either genetically they started out this way, or over time their training in people who have a particular type of talent, their left hemisphere becomes dominant. We don't know which it is. We don't know if their left hemisphere was dominant for music initially or whether it becomes this way. But we do know that in adults who are musicians, you can compare different activation of the brain in musicians than non-musicians. Now, the other thing we've learned is that in musicians, damage to language areas of the brain, that is the dominant hemisphere, can cause a loss of musical ability and appreciation. And this was really quite amazing when it first happened, that we first discovered this. The most famous musician to have demonstrated this loss was Maurice Ravel. And Ravel was a French composer who suffered from progressive left hemisphere damage. And here we have language areas. This is Wernicke's area in the left hemisphere. Wernicke's area being involved in the processing of sound that's related to language, so our ability to understand language. And up here in this area are the areas that we realize are involved critically in being able to read and write language. Well, it turns out these language areas were destroyed in Ravel and gave insight into a musician that had progressive hemisphere damage that changed his ability to appreciate, to write, to enjoy music. So he suffered first of Wernicke's aphasia. So the first thing that apparently was identified in him was a problem with language. Over time, however, he lost the ability to translate musical ideas into musical symbols. And we believe it was because of the progressive damage to these areas here that we now know were involved in being able to write music. He could no longer do that. And ultimately, he had enough left hemisphere damage, he developed amusia. So at the end, he was no longer able to tell one piece of music from another. He could no longer process music. He could hear perfectly fine because it turned out that area 41 was pretty intact in him. There were some things that were intact, but he was no longer able to appreciate music. Now, no discussion of music in the brain would be complete without mentioning something about what we call musical preference. So musical preference is something that a lot of psychologists and neurobiologists have been interested in. So there have been a lot of studies done, and contrary to a public perception that perhaps different types of music are liked by people of higher intelligence or whatever, it turns out there's two main things that are involved in an individual's preference of music. One, and we shouldn't be surprised at this, what type of music you were exposed to in childhood and early adulthood. This critical period of your life, and the same thing is true of language, but here we're talking about musical preference, whether you like jazz or whether you like blues or whether you like classical music. So a lot depends on what you've been exposed to. Now, this isn't going to be true in 100% of the cases, but it's true in enough so that it's statistically significant. So musical preference has a lot to do with what you're exposed to. In my own life, I was exposed to classical music in childhood and actually played classical music on the piano. But I wasn't actually exposed to my favorite genre of music until I was an adult and was an undergraduate at UCLA. And I took a course on jazz. And I remember I had been exposed to jazz before, but the teacher used to have recordings playing every day before we came into class. And I remember the first time I heard Billie Holiday. And it's blues that for some reason has just become something that I just love. I just love the blues, and really hardcore blues. And it just speaks to me somehow. It speaks to me. Classical music does as well. There are few types of music I don't like, but I clearly show a musical preference. Temperament is the other thing that's been shown to play a major role in the type of music that each of us likes. So there's something about how my limbic system is wired that makes blues speak to me in a way that some other type of music doesn't speak to me. And so this is another thing they've discovered about temperament being that stable part of our emotional personality in the way we engage in the world. There are just so many things about music. Someone asked me once what it was that I liked about the blues. How could anybody like the blues? Because it's always, some terrible thing happening and the consequences of our own tragic decisions or whatever. And I thought about it a lot. And one of the things I like about the blues is that the instrument, whatever it is, whether it's the guitar, the harmonica, or the piano, appears more to be an extension of the voice in blues. And I like the way that extension takes place. So it's not just the words of the song or the way it's sung, but actually the way the instrument plays a role in the emotional playing out of the experience. And so when I listen to a performer like Buddy Guy, famous song, Slippin' In, Slippin' Out, he uses the guitar as an extension of his own keening, his own personal experience to communicate his emotional experience to me. So the limbic system is involved not just with the listener, but also with the person who's the performer or the composer. So they're trying to express to you some kind of emotional event, and you're the listener. And so these two things come together in some pretty creative ways and pretty incredible. Music can take us to a place, an emotional place, a stimulation of this endogenous reward system, I believe, in a way that nothing else can. Now, not everyone appreciates music, but I think for those of us who do, it really does. It's almost a rapturous state when we listen to music. Found a quote by T.S. Eliot that I just thought was really good, of all people, about music. Music heard so deeply that it is not heard at all, but you are the music while the music lasts. And for those of us who love music, the type of music we love does that for us and stimulates this wonderful limbic system that allows us to engage with the world emotionally. Thank you.